Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Gold Standard with Alan Mosley, and here's your host, Alan Mosley.
Welcome back to the Gold Standard. I'm so happy you're with us again. This is episode 21. 21.
Now we can drink.
Yeah. Now we can drink. Thank you so much. Well, you're probably going to have to drink if you watch 21 episodes of the Gold Standard. So getting through our routine. If you want to catch us on social media, it is facebook.com/TGS Alan Mosley. Twitter is @Alan M. Mosley. And really, you can just get everything on our website, including our episodes and show notes and links for our guests and everything else, which is thegoldstandardpodcast.com.
Yes, sir.
Now, you'll remember this because you'll be the only one who does.
Okay.
All the way back on like episode 1 of the Gold Standard, I had said, other than current events and different things, I want to have a history episode every now and then because I'm a history guy. You know, I've got a master's in American history from SNHU.
Yeah, good.
And I wanted to do a history episode every now and then, but not me because I'm an idiot. So I want to have someone who knows what they're talking about. So we have got a great treat for you today.
Yes, sir.
We have got Professor Kevin Gutzman on the show with us today.
There he is.
Kevin Gutzman is professor and former chairman in the Department of History at Western Connecticut State University. He has written 5 books, most recently Thomas Jefferson, Revolutionary, A Radical Struggle to Remake America. He holds a bachelor's degree with honors and with special honors in history, a Master of Public Affairs degree, and a law degree from the University of Texas at Austin, as well as an MA and a PhD in American history from the University of Virginia. So that's about 27 more degrees than me.
Yeah.
And that's why we have him on the show.
That's why he's on the show.
Professor Gutzman, how are you doing today?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Well, we're doing very good, and we're so happy to have you. So you,
Yes, sir.
You are probably maybe our 13th or 14th guest total that we've had on the show, but you're the first guest who's coming on specifically for us to have a history episode of the Gold Standard.
Yeah.
Which I think was a good choice on our part.
It was a good choice.
Yes.
Yeah, we're gonna get smart today.
We're gonna get smart today.
Smart.
So I want to start right off the bat with a little bit of an anecdote that you would share because I just want your thoughts on it a little bit. I had listened to you do an interview. I believe it was with Jeff Deist of the Mises Institute, and you had shared the story that when you've taught some intro history classes at Western Connecticut State, you will start off the class by saying, now I know a lot of you think that Thomas Jefferson wrote the Constitution, and I'm telling you that Thomas Jefferson didn't write the Constitution, and when it comes time for the final exam, they're going to write that Thomas Jefferson wrote the Constitution anyway. So explain that for us. What's going on there?
And then they always do. Well, you know, I think it was Mark Twain who said the problem isn't what people don't know, it's what they know that just ain't so.
Yeah.
And there's just a kind of miasma of untruth in the air that people can't get through, no matter how clearly you lighten the world for them. So that's my explanation. There's a kind of inertia in one's brain, and people have a hard time getting things started and making any mental motion. So that's one myth. There are a lot of other myths, too, that people can't get past.
Now, I know when you brought that up, it was kind of in the context of, in the greater debate of the Constitution and the original intent and the ratifying conventions versus the way the Constitution is more modernly represented. Some people like to lump Thomas Jefferson into the Constitution, strict constitutionalist camp, and then you're coming back and say, well, Thomas Jefferson was in France when they wrote the Constitution. So it may be a teensy bit misplaced to say that this particular vague phrase or wording is his fault personally because he didn't write it. So with that in mind, let me just kind of dive headfirst into this. This is probably an unfair question because Thomas Jefferson's not with us, and so I'm having to ask Kevin Gutzman instead. What do you think would be some key differences, if any, or maybe he wouldn't have anything to do with it at all? What would have been the difference in the writing and the ratifying the Constitution if Jefferson had been in the States and not in France?
Almost certainly there would have been some kind of term limits in the Constitution. Mm-hmm. There, of course, are none. And when Jefferson saw the draft Constitution for the first time, his immediate response was there needed to be at least a term limit for the president. He also insisted that there had to be a Bill of Rights, And that was a position that had been taken by two other prominent Virginians in the Philadelphia Convention, both of whom had played important roles in writing the Constitution, and neither of whom ended up signing it, partly because it didn't include a Bill of Rights. Jefferson, I think, was prone to have been clearer about the limits of the power of the Congress in particular. So, his general attitude toward the idea of writing a new constitution was that you didn't want to use a patch that covered the whole garment. And that was the way he saw it. Or another way he put it was, we have this venerable old fabric that we could continue to use if we just made 2 or 3 amendments. And he didn't think it was necessary or even desirable to replace the Articles of Confederation anyway. So if he had been involved in writing the Constitution, I think surely some of these ideas would have been included. In fact, there were significant people, as soon as they publicized the Constitution, as soon as the Philadelphia Convention sent it to Congress, there were immediately people who were saying exactly these things that Jefferson said. So I think his objections to it were going to prove to be common objections, and eventually most of his ideas about what was wrong with it would be taken into account. And for example, Washington ended up serving 2 terms and then retiring because he thought there needed to be a precedent of retirement. Jefferson, then the second president to be reelected, followed him by retiring after 2 terms, and this came to be understood as just a requirement, like saying "so help me God" at the end of the presidential oath, which also is not in the Constitution, but which virtually all of them have done. And so when finally we had a president who accepted election for a 3rd term and he left office, Congress immediately passed and the states immediately ratified a formal amendment saying that 2 terms were all the president would get. I think Jefferson's general feeling was that virtually all legislative authority ought to be in the states, unless the matter at hand were something that only the federal government could handle, like handling diplomatic relations with foreign countries, or providing a common navy, or having a general currency, and those kinds of things.
Now, I really want to emphasize one thing you said really early on there, that musing that if Jefferson had been present at the time, he may have made a strong argument that, well, we can modify the Articles as opposed to throwing the baby out with the bathwater and starting over with the Constitution as it is today. So I guess one thing that I would say, I know what the Articles of Confederation are. I mean, I know us in this conversation do, but I think that that's one of those things that's sort of been lost in history. I think the average public school student either has never heard of the Articles of Confederation before in their life, or you were taught that term one time in 10th grade, and all you were told was, well, they were bad, and so we have the Constitution now. And that's all anyone today would know about, unless you had deeper study in college or of your own personal reading. So help us to understand why is that so? Like why has that been more or less effectively erased from discourse? And where would have Jefferson have put his foot down and said, no, this is worth re-examining?
Well, first I want to take exception to one point you made in passing there, that the choice was between the Articles and, you said, the Constitution as we have it today. That was not an option. In fact, if people had been told you're either going to keep the Articles of Confederation or you're going to have the Constitution that they're going to have in 2018, nobody would have ratified that. Yeah. So we've had extreme alteration in our federal system over time, chiefly through having federal courts either give their imprimatur to what they previously had said were unconstitutional legislative programs of Congress, or having federal courts say, well, from now on we're going to exercise a veto power over this, that, and the other area of state legislation. So I think it's very unlikely that anybody would have agreed to that. Certainly that wasn't what James Madison, for example, thought that the U.S. Constitution was going to be. And so that's one thing. But as to what the Articles of Confederation were, well, they were just kind of formalizing of the informal relationship among the states and the Continental Congress during the Revolution. It was just an attempt, creating the Articles was just an attempt to say, well, we're not only going to have cooperation among delegates sent to a quote-unquote Congress, but we're going to have a document that says how we're going to have cooperation under delegates to a Congress. And we're not only going to have the Congress able to ask states please to contribute money to General Washington's army, but we're going to say how we're going to ask states to contribute money to General Washington's army. It wasn't really what you'd call a government. It didn't have an executive. It didn't have a judiciary. It didn't really have any legislative authority beyond formalizing the way that resolutions would be made. And virtually all the actual government power was left in the state governments or in the states as separate political communities.
Now, I want to jump real quick to one of the links that we had pulled up here. Not Facebook. I'm going to pull up here. We're going to jump around a little bit chronologically. The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution, which I read probably just a few months ago, had reread it a second time. And there's a couple of takeaways that really sat with me through that book. The first one being, and I'll let you touch on this, Hamilton's legacy versus the wishes of the voters, and I know you already know where I'm going with that, in the sense that the vision of Hamilton lost in the voting booth, but won thanks to the judiciary. So I want you to describe for our listeners a little bit the difference between, as someone like maybe a Tom DiLorenzo would put it, the more nationalist or Hamiltonian view versus that of maybe the more decentralized Jeffersonian view, and how did we wind up in an environment where the Jeffersonian view got more votes, but the Hamiltonian view won the day ideologically? How did that come about?
Well, the short version is that there were people who were involved in the Philadelphia Convention, that is the 1787 convention of delegates from 12 states in Philadelphia that ended up writing the U.S. Constitution. There were people in that convention who wanted a national government. That is, they didn't want the decentralized authority model that I described before. Instead, they wanted to have an independent central government with a general power to legislate over any important question, that was able to create courts that could hear essentially any important case, that had an executive who had extreme authority. In fact, one of them, Alexander Hamilton, proposed that the chief executive, whatever title you gave him, should serve for life. And he should appoint senators who serve for life, and he should appoint all the governors, and then you'd have elections for members of the lower house of the legislature every 5 years. Well, this was a position in the Philadelphia Convention that had, we're told, only the support of one more delegate. But the thing is, Hamilton's idea that the central government should be entirely independent of state governments and virtually independent of voters was one that was appealing to other people too. And so, although that position lost in the Philadelphia Convention, and the draft Constitution that was sent to the states for their ratification didn't include any of those elements, ultimately you're going to have something more or less like that as a result of what's called constitutional law. That is, John Marshall, a cousin of Thomas Jefferson's, who served as Chief Justice longer than anyone else in American history, from 1801 to 1834, I think. John Marshall wrote a lot of Hamilton's position into constitutional law, into precedents of the Supreme Court. So, for example, in 1819, this is the most egregious example, in 1819, the question of the constitutionality of the bill that chartered the Second Bank of the United States came before the Supreme Court. One argument was, well, this was unconstitutional because the Congress only had the enumerated powers. And There was no enumerated power to charter a corporation, let alone a bank corporation. Marshall said, well, we have these residual clauses. We have a statement that Congress can tax to provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare. And so this isn't just a power to tax, it's a power to legislate along any lines that Congress claims will provide for the common defense or promote the general welfare. Similarly, at the end of the enumeration of powers in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, there's a statement that besides the enumerated powers, Congress will have authority to adopt whichever laws shall be necessary and proper to put the enumerated powers into effect. And Marshall said, well, that doesn't mean only that Congress can do things that it needs to do in order to put those enumerated powers into effect. If you look at the list of powers he reasoned, you have several that are involved in or related to the economy. And so Congress might say, well, these are really about an end of making the country more prosperous through legislation. So if Congress thinks that some law is necessary or proper, that is, might be useful, helpful, conducive to making America more prosperous, then you could argue, well, that falls under the necessary and proper clause. Notice, it's not necessary. It might not be proper to actually using one of the enumerated powers, but the point is Marshall's tortured reasoning here is going to mean essentially that Congress can do whatever it thinks is a good idea. When James Madison saw Marshall's opinion in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland, his initial response was to say, people who lived through, and he was speaking about himself among others, people who lived through the conventions in which the people agreed to live under the Constitution will be hard to persuade that they would have accepted the Constitution if they had known it was going to be read this way. So that's a kind of typical elliptical Madisonian way of saying this is totally unlike what the people ratified, and they wouldn't have ratified it if they had known it was going to be read this way. So the problem is Jefferson in his old age saw Marshall behaving this way, and he said, we have a real solecism in politics. In other words, we have a real kind of logical error in our system because we have this court that doesn't have to answer to anybody, and it's able to write its own opinions into these cases, and then the federal government can point to those cases in exercising power beyond what the people intended to grant the federal government. This is un-Republican, and it's impossible to correct. There's nothing about the federal Constitution that empowers the people to correct this egregious misbehavior by Marshall and his colleagues. So Jefferson actually, when he had first become president in the 19th century, had his party in Congress try to impeach a federal judge, one of Marshall's colleagues, for behaving pretty much this way, and it failed. And Jefferson said, well, okay, so this power of impeachment turns out to be a mere scarecrow. Now there's really nothing that we can do about this. Over time, then, I show this in the Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution, over time, federal judges realizing that they were kind of like a racehorse with the reins let go, right? They have felt free to legislate about whatever question came to mind. And so essentially, we now know every important social issue that becomes a political issue ultimately will be decided by a federal court. And why do we know that? Is it because the federal Constitution answers every question? Does it decide whether you'll have nude dancing in a bar in Indiana, or whether you'll have capital punishment for people who rape little kids in Louisiana, or whether homosexual union will be equivalent to heterosexual marriage in our law? No, the federal Constitution says about these things that whatever powers aren't delegated to the federal government by the Constitution are denied by it to the states or reserved to the states respectively or to the people. In other words, these questions weren't given to the federal government. They're supposed to be left to the states to decide, but federal judges can go ahead and decide them, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. And so over time, we have more and more of our most important political debates closed off by 9 Harvard and Yale Law School graduates who've been fortunate enough to be favored by some prominent politician, meeting in secret, making all of our most important policy decisions. I predicted 20 years before it happened that ultimately federal courts would decide that the states had to allow gay marriage. Now, I'm not taking a position on gay marriage. My state actually decided that they would have gay marriage, but more states decided that they wouldn't have gay marriage. And ultimately, the Supreme Court said, well, you have to have gay marriage. There's nothing in the Constitution that says states have to have gay marriage. This is supposed to be something that's entirely for the states to decide for themselves. But I knew that the federal courts would decide the question, and why? Well, because, number one, it's fun to do. You can have whatever policy you want. Nobody can stop you. Why wouldn't you decide it? If you don't have any Republican ethics, why wouldn't you decide it? It's fun to do, and number two, there's nothing anybody can do to stop it. So we have essentially this unlimited legislative power in federal courts, and no correction. There's just no way to correct it. If you had time for me to rant about it all day, I could give viewers examples of just horribly egregious abuse of this power by federal courts, of which people disagreed as soon as they came down, and of which they still agree now. They've always disapproved, and yet there's nothing we can do. So over time, we end up with more and more, instead of the kind of a government that the people agreed to by voting, whether for people to ratify the Constitution or ratify amendments or draft amendments in Congress or whatever. Instead of that, we've ended up more and more with just whatever policies tend to be favored by people who went to Harvard Law School and Yale Law School, who, you might be surprised to learn, are entirely unrepresentative of Americans in general, right? They in general, if you want to compare the views of people who've graduated from Yale Law School to views of average Americans, you're going to find a substantial dissimilarity.
Yeah.
And essentially we live in Yale Law School land, not in the United States. That's the way I understand our regime to a large extent. So a big part of the book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution, is illustrating the growing disjunct between Republican government as it was supposed to work under the U.S. Constitution as the people agreed to it, and actually as its authors sold it too, on one hand, and this system we have now where we have government imposed on us, and there's really nothing we can do about it.
Well, Kevin, you're just stealing my thunder, because my next question was going to be, let's talk a little bit about our overlords that rule from the judicial branch, but you've already knocked that one out of the park. So
actually, no, now that you've asked me that question, let me say one more thing. I mentioned egregious cases, and there are a multitude of them that come to mind, but let me just give your viewers one example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Now, I'm not taking a position on capital punishment. I'm not taking a position on what kinds of, if there's going to be capital punishment, what kinds of crimes ought to make somebody susceptible of capital punishment. But I'll just give you an example of one of the current Supreme Court's many offensive statements in relation to this question. This general question. So there was a case a few years back, a handful of years ago, called Kennedy versus Louisiana. It happens that it was called Kennedy versus Louisiana. And ultimately it ended up in the Supreme Court. And the question that the court considered was, is it cruel and unusual punishment to give capital punishment to somebody who has raped a small child? So they have a special statute. They had a special statute in Louisiana that said, if you rape a small child, I think it was like under 6 years old or something like that. If you raped a small child, you could be given capital punishment. So this guy had raped, I believe, a 4-year-old kid. And Louisiana gave him capital punishment. And the case ended up in the Supreme Court. And his defense attorney, or his, attorney for the appellant, said that, well, this violated the cruel and unusual punishment prohibition of the Eighth Amendment as made enforceable against the states through its incorporation into the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, which is another crock invented by the Supreme Court. But anyway, so the way that the Supreme Court, in an opinion by Justice Kennedy, actually, the way the Supreme Court reasoned its conclusion in this case was, we, as a society, and our evolving standards of decency, which is a term they like to use a lot, right? We're going to veto laws that the people have made because we have evolving standards of decency. Who does? Well, Harvard Law School graduates, right? Mm-hmm. So we as a society, in our evolving standards of decency, have come to the conclusion that only the most egregious crimes should make people susceptible of capital punishment. And this crime is not that important a crime. Okay, so treason, yes. Murder, yes. Raping a 4-year-old, if you're on the Supreme Court, you can say that's not that important. Mm-hmm. So ultimately, the Supreme Court, on the ground that raping a kid under age 4 is not very important, decided this miscreant was going to get off. Actually, another part of the opinion, they said, well, we have a shrinking number of states that have these kinds of penalties, and there's kind of growing consensus in the country that you don't do this. Actually, what they left out was Congress, only a couple of years earlier, had passed a similar statute. So if there's a national consensus, how come the federal legislature had just passed such a law? But my point is twofold. One, there's nothing in the Constitution that says that the federal government is supposed to be deciding whether the states are violating the principle of cruel and unusual punishment, because the incorporation doctrine is bogus. The idea that the Eighth Amendment is enforceable against the state governments is bogus in itself. But even if that were not bogus, still, the only somebody who never was elected and never has to account to voters could have put in writing, raping a little kid is not a very important crime, okay? Think about that. I don't know what you think. I think murdering me is not as important as raping a 4-year-old, right? I think it's, what could be worse? Mass murder, shooting the president. There aren't many things worse than that. So the point is, this is what we get. You have this system where the federal judges agree among themselves about what the law ought to be, about what the Constitution ought to say, about what kind of system they wish we had, and then they just say, well, we have evolving standards of decency. Now we have the system we want. And it always turns out that the evolving standards of decency lead them to the policy conclusions they personally favor, right?
Yeah.
So this is...
Imagine that.
Yeah. This is a substitute for Republican government. This is an alternative to having a constitutional system in which ultimately the people get the government they ratified or they voted for their legislators to legislate. It is not anything in common with... It doesn't have anything in common with what you were taught in civics or what you were taught in political science or law school. It's just offensive. I find it offensive. Actually, I don't even get emotional about the hot button issues. Homosexual marriage, abortion, whatever. Actually, those don't really yank my chain. What really gets me is these Harvard and Yale people meeting in secret, thinking they're superior, just proclaiming what their morality, they're more enlightened, they have this Darwinian idea that, well, since we have this idea today, it's by definition superior to what people thought last year, and then they impose it on us.
Yeah. Well, it talks a little. You had mentioned in incorporation, and it gets a little bit into compact theory as well. Of when you make a statement of our evolving sense of decency or evolving sense of morality, or however you want to put it, when you're making a societal claim, what is society? Is society planet Earth and everyone on it? Because we know there's lots of people on planet Earth that think very differently about society. Well, is society the United States of America? Because even then, there's lots of different people in the United States of America. So in the case of this, we're talking about the society of the people of Louisiana, who may be different. We're in Tennessee, and the people of Louisiana may be different than the people in Tennessee or Virginia or Massachusetts or New Hampshire or whatever. And so one of the questions I had, just a really softball thing I had on the list that we've sort of skipped right by, is I've heard you say a number of times that you identify as a Jeffersonian. And I feel like you've really already answered this question with your comments of it's not a matter of my own personal stance on issue X. It's a matter of, let me apply this to the Constitution. Okay, the Constitution doesn't say that I have authority over this, therefore I've passed this on to the states or the people. So let's let's rewind a few minutes and describe for our viewers. When you say, well, I think, I'm a Jeffersonian, or I believe in Jeffersonianism. What exactly does that mean, and how is that different from, say, and I'll follow this up, a quick follow up after you've talked about Jeffersonian. I know this is a history episode, but technically the last 48 hours is technically history. Yes. There was a Supreme Court ruling about the infamous bake the cake scenario in Colorado, and you already know where I'm going with this. That it's all well and good that we are happy that the ruling came forth that the baker doesn't have to bake the cake, but it's sometimes it's not about the ruling, it's why they ruled that way, because that leaves the door opened or closed for more litigation. So talk to us a little bit about what Jeffersonian means, and then I want you to describe to our viewers why it's important how the court rules the way it rules, and why it's such a bad thing if that means infinite litigation in perpetuity and lawyers logging a lot more paid hours on a subject that should be decided.
Well, I understand that Jefferson's basic political philosophy was that people in the state of nature had particular rights which inhered in them. They were endowed with those rights by their creator, and civil society had to take into account that people had responsibilities that were anterior to civil society, and so, among other things, the government shouldn't impose on them any particular religion, because a man's obligation to God, however he understood that God, was more important than his obligation to the state, so long as he wasn't doing anyone actual physical harm. And then once you got to a situation in which there was government, every citizen was entitled, of course adult citizen of sound mind, was entitled to participate in policy making, creating constitutions, electing people to make statutory decisions, electing executives, or at least having some kind of electoral check on people who were in executive office. And the same went for the federal government. The federal government was an institution that had been delegated authority by the people of each state as a discrete political society, and it had, because this was the source of its authority, only the authority that the people had intentionally delegated. So if there came a time when people generally thought that the federal government needed more authority, the way for it to obtain that authority was not just for it to declare, okay, now we have more authority, or we'll go ask our fellow federal officials in the federal courts whether this new unconstitutional law we passed is now constitutional, because it's a really good idea. But instead, Jefferson's idea was, well, the only way that a government could legitimately obtain more authority would be to go out and ask the people for it. So you have to amend the Constitution to give further power to the federal government. And so in general, this means that the federal government has very few areas of authority. And we've gotten to the point where, well, for example, imagine in the election of 2008, you have John McCain against Barack Obama. Which policy idea could either of them have favored, which he thought had to be preceded by a constitutional amendment? And it's a question will make you laugh, but actually, when Jefferson's friend James Madison succeeded him as president, he, like Jefferson, in 2 of his 8 annual State of the Union messages, said that Congress should get in the business of building roads, canals, and bridges. But like Jefferson, in one of those 2 messages, Madison said, before you could do that, of course, you'd have to amend the Constitution. And then on the very last day that he was president, Madison was presented by his allies in Congress with a bill to get Congress into the business of building roads, canals, and bridges. And the last official act of President Madison was to veto that bill, which he had called for repeatedly, as had his friend and closest political ally Jefferson before him. Why? He explained in his bonus bill veto message, which is one of the great statements of American political philosophy, in 1817, Madison's bonus bill veto message, which anybody can find online. Madison said, look, yes, obviously the Western states have no roads at all, and we have more money than we need in the federal government, so building roads, canals, and bridges is a good idea, but I told you that before you could do that, you'd have to make up the defect in your authority, and you didn't, so veto. Mm-hmm. This is Jeffersonian government. That's the way it's supposed to work. The default is you didn't give them authority over you. And if they want authority over you, they have to get it. How are they going to get it? Well, they're going to get it first through your elected representatives in the Congress, then through your elected representatives in your state legislatures. Well, Gutzman, that's hard to do. Yes, that's the point. It's hard to do, right? It's supposed to be hard to do.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean when I say I'm a Jeffersonian.
Yeah. Okay.
It's based on a general respect for the average citizen's his integrity as an individual. And my assumption is that the government can't do anything unless it can justify that it's doing what it's doing by pointing a particular provision of a constitution in which we've said it could do that thing. So I think, of course, people who are thinking about this immediately realize, well, about 95% of the line items in the federal budget are unconstitutional. Shouldn't be a national radio network. There shouldn't be a national TV network. There shouldn't be a Department of Commerce to give Boeing money to sell jets in China or whatever. There shouldn't be a space bus. There shouldn't be, just think about it. Virtually anything the federal government does, people would never have agreed to empower it to do. Yeah. And yet once they do it, the original justification for having, for example, PBS was, well, we only have 3 TV networks. People don't have very much choice. We'd like to have an arts channel. Really? How about now? I have over 100 networks, on my television. I don't need to pay for a federal arts channel. And by the way, in the first place, we never gave the Congress authority to do that. It just did it. Yeah. So that's what I mean.
Well, it's right off the bat, in the very beginning of that, you had talked about the agency of the individual and having the right to pretty much act in their own best interest as long as they weren't hurting someone else. Well, that sounds an awful lot like the libertarian love affair known as the NAP, the non-aggression principle. So I think the philosophy there is very much the same. And so I wanted to focus real quick on a recurring segment we call Mike's Minute, which is just basically a comment or question from our good friend Mike. And he wanted to ask you, speak with us for a moment about some key differences, if there are any, between a constitutional conservative and or a Jeffersonian versus, say, a minarchist libertarian. What, if any, are the key differences between those two people, or are they roughly the same thing?
Well, you could be a leftist, you could be a rightist. A Jeffersonian doesn't have to be a conservative, except in the sense that the government's going to be slight if he gets his way. So beyond that, I don't really see any difference. My friend Tom Woods famously asked Ron Paul on video, "Are you an anarchist?" And Ron said, "Well, I haven't really been able to figure out how you could have a private police force. Now, how are you going to have people consent to live under this private police force?" So the conclusion, of course, is that Ron Paul's a minarchist. And what did you expect? He's been in Congress for 25 years. So his son is too. And that's kind of where I am. I think in general, the federal government, the government in general doesn't do many things well. And that's not coincidentally, there aren't many things I think it ought to do. So on the other hand, I do like the idea of somebody checking the quality of my water. And I do like the idea that if somebody's breaking into my house, I can call a contingent of guys with guns to come stop them, and so on. So we need somebody to enforce contracts. If I make a contract with somebody who's more wealthier and more powerful than I want somebody neutral to be able to enforce it for me. Is that an answer?
Yeah, I think it is. Well, you had mentioned Tom Woods, and so there's no better time to bring that up than now.
Tom's an anarchist, by the way, not an anarchist.
Tom is an anarchist, and I don't really get super hung up on the particular label, because I feel like something that we've discussed on the show in many episodes is one of the, in my opinion, I like to use the term liberty movement more than libertarian or anarchist or whatever, because I feel like there's plenty of people that generally are kosher culture with the concept of not aggressing on their neighbor, not committing violence, but being allowed to pursue their own interests as long as they're not hurting others. I mean, I feel like it's hard for me to be friends with people who don't have sympathy for that position. But on the stance of Tom Woods, so I've actually got here on the desk Who Killed the Constitution that you co-authored with Tom. And I want to pull up the link here very quick so people can see that as well. So we're actually going backwards in time as opposed to starting off with Thomas Jefferson, a revolutionary. So Who Killed the Constitution? The Federal Government versus American Liberty, from World War I to Barack Obama. So that tagline is really important. So we're looking specifically from World War I to Barack Obama. So since we have to leave John Marshall out of the conversation for 5 minutes, so who killed the Constitution specifically from World War I to Barack Obama?
Well, just let me explain where this book came from.
Sure.
So I wrote my first really popular book, New York Times bestseller, was called The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution. And it's a Jeffersonian account of American constitutional history. Mm-hmm. It starts with the imperial crisis after the 7 Years' War for the purpose of explaining why the federal Constitution came to be, how it was sold to people at the time, and then what's been made of it since. And while the book was new, I did tons of media. I did hundreds of radio and TV appearances. I did lots of local and national personal appearances. And in general, people liked the book. It sold really well. Still does, actually, now nearly 11 years later, mm-hmm. Which is very unusual for a book about the Constitution by a guy who's not a Kennedy and isn't at Harvard Law School. But one kind of feedback I got sometimes was, well, of course, we know liberal judges behave that way, right? Yeah. So we know liberal judges ignore the Constitution. So I would say to them, well, if you know liberal judges behave this way, I'm not saying you don't know anything, right? You know something. Mm-hmm. But here's a little secret. It's not only liberals and it's not only judges. So the point of Who Killed the Constitution was to show all three branches of the federal government, both liberals and conservatives, ignoring the Constitution when they felt like it, when they could. And so that's essentially what Tom and I did. We have chapters on leading conservative figures, leading liberal figures. All of them, what do they have in common? Well, they'll do it if they can get away with it, which is not shocking. You think back to Federalist 51, there's Madison basically saying everybody wants all the money, sex, power, and fame he can get, and politicians want even more of it. They want more money, sex, power, and fame than you want. So, yeah, that's true. And that's the point of Who Killed the Constitution. So it wasn't really kind of who were the 12 dastards who did this, so much as what are some of the key points at which the current more or less unlimited internal culture of power within the federal executive, the discrete internal culture of we can do whatever we want within the federal judiciary, and the again discrete internal culture saying we can legislate about whatever we want within the federal legislature. How did those come to be? I think if you read that book, you'll figure that out. So, for example, there's a chapter on conscription, which is, I think, entirely unconstitutional, but it's come to be accepted by both parties. Well, if the government wants to, it can draft people into the military. Really, what's the basis of this claim? And so that's what we take up in that one. And also, there's a chapter in there about Roosevelt's seizing all the gold. People don't realize this happens, right? We don't want to have competition from actual money, so we'll just seize it all. And you end up, at the end of the book, you understand the situation you live in, but then it's kind of depressing because, well, what can you do about it?
Well, so
that's a different issue.
So you should read the book.
Tom's answer is, this is the way any government is always going to be. But I don't think it's quite true. On one hand, it's true that government will be grasping and it'll offend. But on the other hand, it's not true that all governments are interchangeable. It's, the United States is not Cuba or Venezuela or North Korea or even Germany or Britain. It's better than all those in this sense. Part of the reason is that we do have this culture, it's a subculture, but we do have this subculture of resistance to this over time. sometimes people who were on our side were really prominent, as Jefferson and Madison. Sometimes they're very few, but it's an important spark to keep burning, I think.
Well, it can definitely get depressing. So since we're starting to run short on time, and I want to try to leave on at least a little bit of a happier note. So one of the last questions I had from Mike, I won't nail you down to have a specific number. He had said top 5. Who would you say are a top 5? He said heroes of liberty. That sounds awfully official. I said champions. But top 5 people who you would say did the best job on setting us on the path of liberty or Jeffersonian Republican government of the late 18th century and early 19th century. I presume that Thomas Jefferson would be one of those 3 or 5. Who would be a few others that you would say, whether they've been a bit lost in history or whether they're still fairly prominent but not as prominent as we would like? Who were some others other than Jefferson?
Well, George Mason, of course. He's far less well known now, but he was extremely significant in this regard. Richard Bland, who was a cousin of Jefferson's, Senior Burgess, somebody he knew who impressed on him his basic constitutional ideas, I think. Of course, Jefferson and Madison themselves. Those are the main people, as far as I can come up with them off the top of my head. But there are other people who are in the same camp. Ben Franklin, Albert Gallatin, Patrick Henry. So it's not a huge group, but there were important people who were prominent in politics and in intellectual life at the time who took more or less the same position. Sam Adams.
Yeah. So few that made so many.
Yeah, that's right. So, well, I want to revisit one thing, too, that we skipped over a little bit. So I'm not so much interested in getting into the particulars of the Colorado Bake the Cake Supreme Court ruling so much as I am. I follow you on social media. I follow you on Twitter and Facebook, and I've seen you comment on more than one occasion about the woes of decisions being made in such a way that leave the door open for perpetual litigation. So what do you mean by that? So what's the problem with perpetual litigation?
Well, it just means that the issue hasn't really been decided. And so in this case, for example, what happened was that, yes, the particular baker won his case. On the other hand, the ground on which the court majority decided in his favor, that is the explanation of the decision that they gave, and that's where the guidance for lower authorities comes from. That if you're on a federal district court, or that is a federal trial court, or a federal circuit court of appeals, or if you're the federal Congress or the president, other members of the federal executive branch, or if you're in the Colorado Human Rights Commission, which is where the people who lost the case came from, and so on, you're supposed to take that explanation of the court's decision as guidance. And what Justice Kennedy, again, that guy, what he said was, well, the real problem here is the language that was used by the commissioners. You know, you compared Christianity in this man's mind to slavery and Nazism and so on, and that this was not respectful at all, Kennedy said. So in future, such commissioners have to demonstrate more respect for the baker's conscience than they did in this case. You know, what I'm reading is, well, it's not really about how you reason or what conclusion you reach. We just want you to use nicer language. So they could have reached the same decision without saying this sounds like a Nazi, and he would have been fine with that. There's a famous, well, maybe it's not as famous now, but when I was in law school in the late 80s, graduating in 1990, one of the most famous cases in this general area was a case called Bakke versus Board of Regents of the University of California, and it was about the situation at the University of California Medical School in which they had racial quotas in admissions. They had a firm number of people of each race who were going to be admitted each year. And so Bakke, who was a white applicant, far more qualified by the measures, the objective measures they were using than the black and Hispanic people they were admitting, said, well, you've discriminated against me on the basis of my race. And the court ultimately, the Supreme Court in the Bakke decision said, well, you can't have these racial quotas, right? You can't have a firm number of whites, blacks, and Hispanics you're going to admit to the University of California Medical School. But if you didn't call them quotas, then, So what ended up happening, of course, is today, not only does every significant post-secondary school in America have preferences, which amount to quotas without the numbers, but so do major law firms, medical practices, major corporations. American society is shot through with racial preferences. Now it's systemic. It's throughout our society. And so really Bakke lost. Even though the court said, well, you can't have racial quotas, really what it amounted to was saying, well, but you can have them as long as you don't call them quotas. And that's how I read Justice Kennedy's opinion in this cake shop case. Essentially, he said, yeah, you're very disrespectful in comparing this guy to a Nazi. So don't do that, right? Go ahead and rule against him because of his, saying you don't really care about his religious objection, and you're not going to respect his free exercise claim, but don't tell us it's because you think his religion is stupid or offensive the way you did this time. Next time, just say, oh, well, we weighed the interest of the gay guys who wanted him to bake the cake, and we weighed his interest in following the dictates of his conscience, and so we decided in favor of the gay guys who wanted him to bake the cake. He could... future litigants could lose every case in the future so long as the commissioners didn't call them names.
Yeah.
And that would be perfectly consistent with what Kennedy said. I think then this is a one-hit wonder, right? It only comes down on the Christian guys or religious guys' side one time, and in the future, I would expect that those commissioners would always find against similarly situated litigants.
Yeah. Well, we're running short on time. I want to bring back up the browser real quick, because the more recent book is Thomas Jefferson, Revolutionary: A Radical Struggle to Remake America. Professor Gutzman, I feel like we're going to have you back on the show, because any one of the topics we've gone over today could have been in of itself a whole mini series of episodes, and that's one of the tough things about interviewing and history at large. But one thing real quick I wanted to touch on before we let you go, because we're actually going to have Jeff Deist on next week, and when I listened to you talk to him and you guys were talking about Thomas Jefferson, a revolutionary, you had touched on Jefferson's issues with William and Mary, which ultimately begot the founding of University of Virginia, and how this was really revolutionary in the university sphere, because the universities, University of Arkansas, University of Tennessee, University of Michigan, that sprung out of Jefferson and founding of the University of Virginia. So describe that for us a little bit.
Well, you mentioned various states' public universities, flagship universities. Essentially, although it's true that Virginia has a university, so does Delaware, so does New Hampshire, so does Idaho, all those others are little UVAs. So at the time Jefferson was in the business of trying to reform William and Mary, and then having failed to do that, having decided to create the University of Virginia, was working on that. If you went to college in Germany or Italy or England or Spain or Virginia, you got essentially the same kind of education. You were reading the same books, and they were in Greek and Latin, and you were doing this the same way. But Jefferson had the idea that, well, no, this should work differently. So, for example, we're not going to have instruction be the teacher tells you memorize these 2 pages of Greek grammar forms, and then when you come into class 2 days from now, I'm going to have you stand up next to your desk and recite those 2 pages for me in Greek. We're not going to tell you that here's your 4-year curriculum. You're going to take exactly these classes in exactly this order from exactly these teachers and with these classmates, regardless whether you even care about Greek or even have any use for knowing Latin, or even think I care about theology. You're going to have to take this theology because that's part of what we do here. Jefferson had the idea that, well, people should be able to make their own curricula. And they should do particular reading, and then instead of recitations, we should ask them to write essays on essay examinations. Actually, the University of Virginia was the first place anywhere that had essay examinations. I hazard that every university in America has essay examinations now. Every one of them allows students to choose their own majors. Every one of them, if it's big enough, allows students to choose which professors' sections they want to take, and we don't have any recitation going on. And essentially, the whole thing has become Jeffersonian. And you can notice that each of these ways I've mentioned that our contemporary expectations about the way a university will work were different from the old one. It's more democratic now. You had a top-down, this is based on theology, Greek, Latin. We're going to tell you what to do, and when you get done with it, you're going to know what we wanted you to know. Jefferson thought, well, it could be that you wanted to study agronomy, or it could be that you wanted to study chemistry, or it could be that you wanted to study what were called belles lettres, which we would call, poetry and prose. And then you could study that. You didn't have to do it for 4 years. You could decide, I want to do it for 1 year. Maybe you'd want to do it for 5 years. Maybe you could do it for this semester and come back 6 years from now. And it was going to be entirely up to you. So we shouldn't call anybody freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, he said, because, well, I'm in my 70s, and I wouldn't say I'm a senior in learning. So I don't think an 18-year-old or 22-year-old is going to be a senior in learning.
Sure.
The whole thing, in other words, has been radically leveled in terms of the authority of the people who are running it. Oh, and another thing is, Jefferson had the idea that instead of political people or bishops running the schools, they should be run by the professors. The professors should be the ones who decide the order in which you take the classes and what the content of each course will be and that kind of thing. This also was radically democratic. So the whole idea of it. Oh, and one last thing. Of course, in Jefferson's day, only Jefferson and Madison and these people who were, among other things they had in common, ultra rich. Jefferson was the richest man in Albemarle County. James Madison's father was the richest man in Orange County. And those are the only people in the whole county who are going to William and Mary. Nobody else is getting any education at all. And Jefferson thought there ought to be public education. Each community ought to have 3 years in a local schoolhouse for everybody of sound mind who reaches a certain age. And then at the end of those 3 years, we'll send the ablest people on for 3 more years. And then at the end of those 3 years, the ablest of them will go to William and Mary on the taxpayer. What's the point of this? The point of this is, again, it's highly democratic. If you're able, now you're going to be able to get an education. In colonial Virginia, only the wealthiest people got an education. So the whole thing was intended to take away the exclusive access to education of the landed elite, who were few and rich beyond imagining. Besides the fact that they own tens of thousands of acres, they own hundreds of people.
Yeah.
And give this to everybody, right? Yeah. It's amazing. It's radical, really radical. That's one reason why the word radical appears in my book's title.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's beyond the actual story of University of Virginia itself. It's definitely, I would definitely count Jefferson among a revolutionary, specifically because he is counted amongst that financial and political elite. But he of that caste is saying, no, it shouldn't be this way. We should be opening educational opportunities to the people at large. Whereas perhaps his own neighbors in that elite would be saying, Thomas, what are you doing? That's why he didn't succeed in having those elementary schools created. And in fact, when Jefferson died, UVA had been up and running. So next year is going to be the bicentennial of UVA. Jefferson died in 1826. There was only William and Mary. And then there was inland UVA, but there still weren't public schools because what? Because the other landowners didn't want to pay for them. Sure. And actually, this was not a critic's position. This is what allied politicians who tried to push this through as governor or in the legislature, that's what they told him. Well, people just don't want to pay for this. So it wasn't going to be until Reconstruction that Virginia had public schools. Wow. Well,
Yeah.
we're running out of time. I want to go over real quick. So it is kevingutzman.com where you can find more about Professor Gutzman, and he has his books, articles, many things there. We're also going to have the Amazon links to Thomas Jefferson, Revolutionary, A Radical Struggle to Remake America. We also discussed the Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution, which I did personally enjoy a lot, and Who Killed the Constitution, the Federal Government versus American Liberty from World War I to Barack Obama. But that's only if you can stomach a dirty anarchist like Tom Woods. If you can stomach that, then you can enjoy that book as well. Professor
Tom's
Gutzman,
Tom's a reputable anarchist.
yes, he's well. It's funny that so are you implying that he's allowable opinion? Is that what you're trying to say?
No, well, Tom's position on the constitutional issues is this is what they purport to stand for, and they don't. So we should hold this up to them, right? Here, look, you claim that you're respecting this. So as far as he's concerned, if there were a legitimate argument, it would be the Jeffersonian argument.
I like that. See, one day we're gonna try really hard to get Tom on the show, and I'm gonna have Kevin Gutzman on to describe Tom's policy positions. Then I'm gonna have Tom on to describe Kevin Gutzman's policy positions. I think that's
one other thing to notice. By the way, Jefferson wrote repeatedly that he thought the American Indians, who had no government at all, as far as he could see, had a better situation than the Virginians had. So maybe he was ultimately an anarchist too.
I think so. We're going to have to save that debate for another mini series of episodes. I even feel bad asking you questions like, well, how would Jefferson have done the Constitution different or whatever? Because I feel like you can go down a rabbit hole for eons of, well, if the gentlemen were literally sitting here today, what would they say or think about X, Y, and Z? I know those are tough questions, but unfortunately for you, you're our closest stand-in, so that's why you get them. Professor Gutzman, thank you so much for being on the show with us today.
I was happy to do it.
Blake, do you have anything else for us?
No, I am enlightened.
I know.
I'm very impressed. Now I'm going to be doing more research on Thomas Jefferson.
Kevin, our producer Blake here, is just this whole time you've been speaking, he's just been
like a sponge.
He's just in full absorption mode the whole time. Appreciate it, buddy. I thank you so much. So, thegoldstandard.com, Facebook.com/TGS Alan Mosley, Twitter @Alan M. Mosley.
That's right. And that's pretty much
I think we're good.
this one. Yes, sir. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gutzman.
You're welcome.
Join us next week.
We'll see you next time.